Welcome to our collective bargaining forum that is sponsored by the Worker Coalition, Salina Area Worker Coalition. Our purpose is to explore how workers contribute to the community and promote the value of workers to society. During the past week, legislative issues related to collective bargaining have been on the forefront. Also, farming issues have dominated some of the legislative discussion. And at our recent legislative forum here in Salina, there were some questions about collective bargaining that came up. So we really have a unique opportunity here to explore collective bargaining in a larger perspective than is normally thought. We usually think of collective bargaining as something that relates to trade unions and teachers, but surprisingly, it does relate to agriculture too. So we have two guests with us today that have an agriculture background, and we have someone with a trade union background. And let me just introduce the guest to you. Donn Teske is president of the Kansas Farmers Union. I've known Donn for 20 years. Donn's involved in multiple organizations and committees in Kansas and outside of Kansas. Lisa Ochs is chairman of Kansas American Federation of Teachers. She's a psychologist by trade and grew up in western Kansas, I understand. Has some farm connections. And Oren Holle, I've known for 3 decades. He's worked with numerous groups and is an experienced collective bargaining farm marketing person. So without further ado, I'm just going to ask each of them to tell a little bit their story a little. So Donn, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm Donn Teske. My family, we farm northeast of Manhattan in Potawatomi County. We're kind of on the east edge of the Flint Hills and have a lot of native prairie and some cropping in between the rocks and hills. Farm full-time most of my life. Kathy and I have raised 4 kids, sent them out into the world. In the 1990s, I started working some for Kansas State University as an ag econ, as an analyst, and for Kansas Rural Center and the Clean Water Farms Project. And then in 2000, I was elected president of Kansas Farmers Union and serve in that role now yet. So I am happy to be here. Kansas Farmers Union is a wonderful organization. I look forward to visiting with you a little bit about it and what we do as a group and advocacy group. So turn it over to the next one.
Hi, my name is Lisa Ochs, and as has already been previously mentioned, I grew up as a farm girl myself out in western Kansas. And when I think back at growing up on a farm, as you may recall, back in the 80s, the farm crisis that was sweeping the country, my family too was involved in that. And my first experience as an activist to fight for anything that was absolutely worthwhile was going to rallies at the state capitol when they had the tractorcade. My parents were involved with that, and with the American agricultural movement. So I guess that was kind of how my love of activism and fighting for the good for the little person really came about. Since then, I went on to school at Fort Hays State University. As has been mentioned, got my master's degree in psychology and started working for the state of Kansas at first out in Larned and then most recently at the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex as a psychologist. My sisters are teachers. My mother was a nurse, also working for the state of Kansas. So we have a long history of not only farming but public service as well in our family. When I was working at the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex, I had an opportunity to join our union. At that time, the Kansas Organization of State Employees was a new union that was forming in the state of Kansas, and it was a merged local between the American Federation of Teachers and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. At that time, again, my love for activism was revived, and I began getting involved in my union. And next thing I know, I was being asked to run for president. I foolishly asked what kind of time commitment are we talking? And they said, and I fell for this, they said, well, you'd write, sign a few checks, hold a few meetings. We think you can do it. So yes, even though consider myself to be a reasonably educated and bright person, I fell for that. Nonetheless, I got involved with COAS, as it was known, and I also ended up running for president of my organization. And at the statewide level, as I mentioned, it's part of 2 national unions, but COAS is also a part of the American Federation of Teachers in Kansas, or AFT Kansas, as we're known. And I ran for president of that organization as well. So that's where I'm currently just holding one position now, just wearing one hat. But in Kansas, for AFT Kansas, we represent some teachers in concert with KNEA. We also represent some school support staff. We represent, obviously, state employees, some county employees, and nurses at KU Med. So the types of workers that we represent is broad and diverse. But since I've been involved, obviously, there have been lots of opportunity for collective bargaining and activism, which I'm sure that we will talk more about here in just a little bit.
I'm Oren Holle. I live in Marshall County. I'm a farmer. Have been all my life. And that's been the basis of my occupation. Actually goes back a little bit of a historical perspective there. In the late 50s, I was in 4-H. And of course, all of us started with projects. And out there on our farm, we earned those projects, but never had cash. Got paid, got a calf to start a farm enterprise. And one of the things that went along with that was record keeping. They were teaching us how to do that. And those inputs into those projects, it kind of kept on going. An uncle rented a farm and had a little farm ground. It was closer to our place than it was to his. And so he rented a few acres to me. And so then I had a cropping project. So that was back in the days, farm machinery didn't transport as easily as it does nowadays. They had to be close by in order to farm away from home. So that naturally led into VOAG in high school and FFA, as an organization. Stanley Larson, a VOAG instructor, I'd classify him as a good instructor. And when it came to the record-keeping part of our projects that we had going, knowing what your costs were out there on the farm, that was his mantra. In order, if you're going to make a profit, you got to know what your costs are. Well, that made sense, and he spent a lot of time teaching us how to do that. But when my enterprise started including hogs in the project, the first hogs I sold, I had 14 of them, and I paid $17 a piece for the privilege of owning them. And so in the course of that discussion, it raised a serious question. Do all this stuff about cost analysis, but what about the price from the market? Well, from an educated ag instructor, the answer that I get is, it's always been that way. So it's ingrained in the process. And you have to be aware of the trends, stay in the top half of the market. That's where you're going to stay in business. And, but my mind said that if I could do something for profitability on my farm that had to do with the price that I got when I went to the market, that was going to do more than all the rest of that. And so that's what led me to this whole field of how we could work together with other people in order to have some kind of a voice, in that particular part of the process. And so I think I'll save the rest of my comments more specifically about collective bargaining.
Why don't we go around, everybody introduce yourself and say one thing about yourself. So start over here.
Gary Martins, retired federal employee, grew up on a farm.
Shirley Japes, retired county clerk.
Thea Neefeld, my first career was as a union organizer.
I'm Tom Maxey. I'm currently a student at Salina Tech, and I'm an ex-aircraft worker.
Yes, I'm Bill Ripe, and I've worked aircraft as well, and I run a small farm south of Abilene.
I'm David Norland, and I grew up summers at my grandfather's place. My first income was from egg gathering because Grandpa said if you take care of the eggs, you can have the check. It's safe to do that because I was only there 4 weeks out of the summer. But as Lisa and I were discussing, I'm from the good part of the place, Rush County. And but
Good people there.
But know the farm in Smith County, but my calling has been more as a college instructor. I'm retired from that now and try to make trouble as much as possible wherever I can.
I'm Phil Black. I'm the current chair of Saline County Democrats and president of USD 305's Board of Education. My background's more in education. My brother, my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law's parents, brother also, all these people were public school teachers. I ended up in post-secondary. So like David, I taught at the college level, was dean at Brown Mackey for 9 years. So that's more of where I come. But I was a member of the Teamsters Union, of the Musicians Union, and of the Labor Union in Kansas City. So I got kind of a strong background that way.
Pat French, I'm a union carpenter.
Bob Storr, homegrown Kansas boy, retired from Railroader, Teamsters. Work with the Working Kansas Alliance and the Salina Area Workers Coalition.
I'm Ted Hale. I'm a retired marketing consultant with a cold. My wife recently passed away. She grew up on a small Kansas farm. Her father was, in addition to a summertime farmer, he was a high school principal. And and of course, her mother worked as a farm wife. From that family of 6, there turned out to be 3 college professors, a sister who works in the Attorney General's office in California, and, well, 2 other good people. And before she passed away, we passed on our small amount of farmland onto a family member who is continuing the farming tradition. And so for 37 years, I've been filling out Form 4835, and but no more. But I feel a close connection to my wife's family and to the farming tradition that represented.
Okay. We have a very knowledgeable group, and I thank you for your attendance here. The first question that we have to look at, and the theme of this discussion is collective bargaining good for Kansas? So what I'd like to have each of the panelists do is to talk about cooperative bargaining or collective bargaining from your experience, and I want all of you to feel free to ask them questions as they share their comments. So Donn, do you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Kansas Farmers Union was originally created in 1902 in Texas, and it came out of the cotton fields, and the farmers couldn't get a price. They only had one place to take their cotton, and they just had to take what they could get. And they started working together, formed the National Farmers Union, and that spread like wildfire. And in 1907, it came into Kansas. By 1918, we had 110,000 members in Kansas. Virtually every rural elevator you see in the communities, that was built by Farmers Union locals. They'd form a local, they'd build their elevator, and then they'd collect their grain and start selling it together and buy their inputs in volume. And so it's not collective bargaining like you would talk in a labor union, but they started taking advantage of economy of scale. And in 1924, Kansas Farmers Union successfully created and implemented a 44 million bushel wheat pool, where farmers held back 44 million bushels of wheat off the market until they got the price that they wanted working together. That was extremely successful, scared the crap out of the federal government. That's what led to the successful wheat pool of the Canadian wheat pool, and that's been up into modern times. And so it works very well, but some corporations don't like it too well. In 1914, Jobbing Association was formed by 44 farmers, and that eventually grew into the largest farm cooperative in the nation, Farmland Industries. It's no longer it's no longer there anymore, but the largest farm cooperative in the nation now is CHS, and that was formed by the Northern States Farmers Unions. And that's, if you see the Cenex gas stations, that's CHS. And Petroleum Refinery McPherson is owned by CHS. And that's a cooperative. And the work has kind of evolved now into more working with value-added co-ops. One of the success stories I'm fairly proud of is the High Plains Food Co-op. That's a group of 80-some producers now in northwest Kansas that's marketing their production online and then delivery points in the Front Range. And so if they can successfully do a marketing cooperative for northwest Kansas, you can do it anywhere. And we do a lot of activism. We have about 300,000 members nationally. We have a good staff in D.C. We're very active in the development of the Farm Bill and legislation around that. We pride ourselves in supporting the family farm. We like payment limitations on the crop payments, and we like country of origin labeling was a farmers union effort to get through, and we think that can do good things for our members. We do a lot of things like that, and so we always have our finger on it. Right now, we got a legislative session going on in Topeka where we got a bunch of raccoons running around there that don't know what they're doing. And I've got a staffer down there watching this full time, and it's quite the circus.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure. If any of you have questions.
Would you say that one of the biggest, I don't want to call it enemies, oppositions to farmers union and the like would be simply the commodities market itself, or is it?
The monopolization and the concentration in the market system is.
So investors, in other words.
The death of the family farm as we know it, absolutely. And what's really hurt in the last couple of decades is the Chicago Board of Trade, where they took the laws off that you actually had to own the commodity that you were trading or take possession of it. Now it's 5-second trades, and rumors affect the market, and there's no correlation anymore to supply and demand. It's just a gambling game.
Thank you.
There seems to be, you mentioned the death of the little Kansas farmer in favor of the corporations, and our current governor wants to relax corporate, the laws governing corporate farming in Kansas. Do you see the downside on that?
Oh, it's horrific, but this has been a long decline. This isn't just it's Senate Bill 191 is what you're talking about, and that's the end of any type of restriction on corporate farming in Kansas, and Secretary Rodman publicly is promoting that, and what since the 1980s they've been whittling away at it. They took a big hunk out of it last year. This is the last of it. But the big thing to be aware of about this one is it takes off the restrictions of overseas ownership of land and out of state and et cetera. So I've never heard this said in Kansas, but there's a similar bill identical to it that's been introduced in Wisconsin, and there the Realtor Association is very involved in it, and they have inquiries from overseas investors wanting to invest in American farmland, and they want to eliminate that so that is available. And that really bothers me. It bothers me that they don't see the value of a family farm and what it does to the community, what it does to keep your churches going, your hospitals, your schools. And if you want to see Kansas 10 years from now, go to the Panhandle of Texas. It's just super modern ag, and the main streets of the county seed is boarded up, the hospitals are closing, and the schools can't maintain their funding because it's a population of citizens that have a lower income than what was there before. And then to top it all off, then they got Senate Bill 202 out there. And so what that'll do is encourage corporate investment in agriculture in Kansas. And so up to $10 million a year is what the budget office has estimated it will cost the state of Kansas in tax incentives, so corporations will come in and locate in Kansas. So not only are they taking away any restrictions for corporations, they don't even let us be on the same playing field. So how do you compete against that? And how do you compete against an administration that wants that to happen in Kansas? They adamantly want more hog farms, they want more poultry farms. You've seen what that's done to the economies of the communities where they are. That's not economic development, that's real depopulation. Yes?
So how is the value-added co-op an alternative?
We're always told as family farms that we can't compete because of economy of scale. And so if you own your own elevator and everybody contributes toward that, then you get the volumes to purchase and sell at the economy of scale that should work. Now the corporations have gotten so much control that's less effective than it used to be. But it's still something I'm very proud to be involved in, and it gives me an edge that I don't otherwise. And what's kind of neat about a cooperative in the community is that they're going to buy and sell at the same prices that the competitors do, but then you own a share of it, so if they actually make money on it, then you get a dividend back. So it's not like they're taking out the competition, it just gives us an option to work together.
Were these bills that you mentioned, were they the product of ALEC?
Sounds like it.
I mean, since they're similar?
Since Secretary Rodman has been appointed Secretary of Agriculture, this has been the top thing on his agenda.
Mm-hmm.
He tried to take a hunk out of it last year, and now he's trying to finish it. And if you look at pure economics, I suppose it does make sense. But I look at things I call social economics, and what does it do to a community? What does it do to your multi-generation farms? And where are our farmers going to come from the next generation? I'm very proud of my 4 kids. So far, they stayed out of prison, and I think they're going to contribute to society. And I'm real proud of them. And I'm really proud that they had the opportunity to grow up on a farm. And
what's ironic is that the same guys that are trying to do this are the ones who complain that the federal government is owned by the Chinese. But that's exactly what's going to happen.
And it's the same administration that says you want to get government out of your business.
Right.
But this Senate Bill 191 is 8 pages. It is not like we repeal the corporate laws. It's 8 pages. And you get down and read down through that. Mostly it's protecting the corporations from county interference. And so they've taken away what county rights they have to say. If a corporation wants to come, if this Senate bill passes as it is, if a corporation wants to come into a county and the county doesn't want it in there, there's nothing they can do about it.
Even if they're owned by the Chinese, right? Because it can be out of the nation, right? It doesn't have to be just out of state. It can be
right.
Right.
But just to have the right to say whether you want to allow a massive hog farm into your county, the state government that says we have too much government is telling the counties that they can't do anything about it.
Taking away their local control.
Taking away local control. It's just such an oxymoron. It just flabbergasts me. I just can't understand what's going on.
To your question about if this is ALEC proposed legislation, because the first time that I saw that they were going to be proposing something like this, before it came out in bill form, because so many of the pieces of legislation that are being ramrodded through the Kansas legislature this year are in fact pieces of ALEC model legislation. I contacted our national headquarters. They have somebody who does nothing but research ALEC model legislation, and I said, is this out of the ALEC playbook? And they couldn't find any direct matches, unlike some of the others that are pretty much word for word from that playbook. But I asked that very same question because it does sound like an ALEC trick, and it sounds like they are bigger game plan.
So are the things that are coming up on the collective bargaining out of ALEC too?
Yep,
I mean, in your
word
area?
for word. Some of them are word for word. They haven't even paid attention to the statutes that they're modifying. They're just copying and pasting word for word from the ALEC playbook and trying to implement it everywhere.
And you mentioned
For those
Wisconsin
that-
being,
Let me interrupt you. For those that might be in the audience that do not know what ALEC is, could you quickly give us a
Yeah,
quick
sure.
overview?
ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council, and basically it is a group of big corporations. Individual legislators can also be a part of ALEC, and our leadership in the Kansas State House are board members of ALEC. And essentially the pieces of legislation that they roll out, they call it model legislation. They meet behind closed doors. They come up with ways to change state laws, basically to get their control and their power state by state rather than at a national level. And that's what they began to implement in state houses then, is their corporate crafted pieces of legislation that does nothing to help communities, schools, individuals, but everything to help corporations, just like, and this is exactly why I thought the farming bill that came out might be a piece of ALEC legislation, so.
And this legislation this year, legislator of the session, is just full of crap. I realize that we're on TV and that's not gonna benefit the viewers, but over on the table is our state newsletter that just went to press yesterday, and I've got my updated legislative bills in there, so there's 2 pages of bills that we're either opposed to or watching, and they're insane. I mean, there's one bill that will make outlaw any public fund use of anything that includes the word sustainable in it. And so, what does that mean?
It means anything must be unsustainable.
And so, for the viewers on TV, if you go to the Kansas Farmers Union website, you can find our latest edition of Contact on there, and the legislative updates will be on there. And also, the young man I have watching the legislature is blogging from there, so, and his blogs are on it. So, if you want to get an agricultural perspective, it's a pretty good spot to follow.
Don, I wanted to add, you mentioned Wisconsin being another state where they're implementing those laws. Kurt Mina from the Alva Leopold Institute, biographer of Alva Leopold and the Land Ethic, was here, and he was talking about this week the law there that will free up in the same way to outside corporations the mining interest, and there are like no restrictions on the mining. Very good chance that they will totally pollute the Great Lakes. No conscious thought about what it's just open it up to the moneyed interests.
Yep.
So that mirrors that same pattern.
And I talk about Senate Bill 191 and 202, but there's a whole raft of bills that's going to help with like corporate hog farms and separation distance from the next places, the waste sites. I mean, there's a whole raft of bills that's just streamlined to help corporate agriculture move without any restrictions. And then it's going to be at the cost of our economy. It's going to be at the cost of our environment.
I think it would be important to note too, if any of you or anyone who's viewing this is not familiar with ALEC, there is a website, it's called alecexposed.org, and you can go to that website and you can go through there and you can see the pieces of model legislation that they are trying to implement in states across the nation. You can also go on there to find out which Kansas legislators are members of ALEC. So if you're interested in knowing if your legislator is working for you or for the citizens of the state or for other corporations, you can go and check that out.
We've been talking about legislation and ag legislation. I want to move now to the question of legislation related to teachers and to trade unions. And if each of you could kind of address that.
Well, I have quite a long list. Like I mentioned, ALEC has spent a lot of time, and to their credit, they have been patient, they've been thoughtful in implementing their strategy and being able to roll out pieces of legislation like they have across the country. It began probably in Wisconsin, and you saw the labor wars that erupted in Wisconsin. This year, before the Kansas legislature, and I have to absolutely agree with what Donn has to say about the pieces of legislation that have been introduced have been absolutely crazy. And furthermore, they're pieces of legislation that are attempting to address problems that do not exist. One piece of legislation that was rolled out was House Bill 2384, which essentially would get rid of the civil service system for state employees. And when the civil service system was put in place, partly it was put in place because in order to receive federal dollars for certain programs, the workforce that is expected to carry out those programs, since they receive federal money, they have to be a part of a merit system. They introduced a piece of legislation that would completely get rid of civil service. Interestingly enough, this went before the House Appropriations Committee, and this apparently was such an important piece of legislation. There were absolutely no proponents who spoke in favor of it. There were opponents who came forth, including the attorney who represents our organization, and says, you know that if you do this, you're in danger of losing federal funding for programs because they must be a part of a merit system. Otherwise, there could be drastic changes in all of state government every time there was somebody newly elected to office. And it would be a big political gamesmanship rather than a system devised to serve all of the people regardless of political affiliation. So there were two opponents, and the issue was brought up that they hadn't begun to address the fiscal note because they hadn't accounted for all of the federal monies that the state would lose if they abolished this system. Eventually, the chair of the committee said, well, I wasn't the only one who worked on this, and nobody else will speak up and say that they did, so I will. So there was one person who would even claim ownership of that piece of legislation. The House Appropriations hasn't worked that bill yet, and supposedly they're supposed to work that bill sometime in this coming week. We'll see what happens, but I can't imagine that we'll go anywhere, but you just never know. So that's one piece of legislation and that's come out of ALEC as well, that type of activity. House Bill 2023 is now called, in the Senate, on the Senate, they substituted, amended 2022 and added 2023. So now the substitute for House Bill 2022 basically says that an employer can withhold money from an employee's wages without the permission for like damaged uniforms, equipment, anything like that. Well, we also represent people in KDOT and lots of places, so does that mean that the employer is now going to be able to, if you get a dent in your truck, to be able to hold that out of your paycheck? That's what that will mean if this piece of legislation passes. The second part of it was originally what they called the Paycheck Deception Bill. It's what we call the paycheck deception. They call it paycheck protection, but we call it paycheck deception because basically it says that the state will not participate in withholding any kind of voluntary contributions to a political action committee by payroll deduction. Many companies do it through the state of Kansas. Many other organizations do it, but this was targeted specifically at labor unions. We believe, and the chamber lobbyist came out in testimony and said, I need this to pass so I can get rid of public sector unions. And we were stunned that they were as honest with the public as they were about their intentions. Essentially what that will do is, on a large part, silence teachers and public workers and hamper their ability to participate in the political process. It was amended just Friday, yesterday? Yeah, yesterday was Friday, wasn't it? All my days are running together. It was amended yesterday in the Senate, and they made some improvements, but the fact is that this piece of legislation is absolutely unfair. It's targeting one specific group of people. And it's interesting because they say, well, the government shouldn't be, the taxpayers shouldn't bear the burden of having to collect or transfer money from a paycheck to a political action fund. They refuse to pay any attention to the fact that our union pays for that every single time. So actually the state probably was making a few bucks off of our doing that. But nonetheless, it did pass the Senate as amended, and now it's gone over to the state, or to the House side. And if they vote to concur, then that bill will go directly to the governor's office desk for signature. If it does not, if they do not vote to concur on that piece of legislation, then it'll likely go to a conference committee. So I guess as we wait and see what happens in the House this coming week on that particular bill. The next one that has received a lot of attention is House Bill 2027, and essentially this would, for all intents and purposes, completely gut the ability for teachers and instructors at community colleges to collectively bargain with the employer. The way the bill is written, they said, well, anybody should be able to engage in negotiations as an individual with their Board of Education. Not only will this be completely chaotic in the state of Kansas, it also gives pretty much the school board an option of whether that not they will accept the representative that the members of the teachers choose. So essentially then the boss will be deciding who represents the teachers rather than the teachers deciding who represents the teachers. Of course, we think that is an incredibly bad idea, and as we're talking about collective bargaining, whether it's with an employer or with vendors, collective bargaining is important for any profession in any state because essentially it allows people who share a common interest, a common issue, to be able to come together and have a discussion about what can we do to go about improving our working conditions. And for this one especially, I will tell you that there is solid research that shows that in those states where teachers are able to collectively bargain with their employer, that the student outcomes are so much higher, that there is tremendous value in both sides. And to be clear, of course, they're not always going to have the same viewpoints, but this is an opportunity for teachers, for any professionals to sit down with an employer, say, this is something that we see as a problem. And on a grander scale, collectively bargaining and coming together around common issues and being able to lobby state legislators. I know for those of you who are teachers or maybe who know teachers, you probably know that a lot of times they are spending money out of their own pockets to be able to make sure that they have enough supplies and things that they need to do the jobs that need to be done in the classroom. And I think that is a crying shame, but they do it because they're professionals, because they're committed to the profession. So in cases like this, it makes absolutely complete sense to me that teachers and school board members and principals and superintendents should all be lobbying together, for example, at the State House to ensure that there is funding to make sure that our schools and our kids in Kansas get the education that they need. I mentioned earlier that we represent some nurses too. When we're talking about collective bargaining, I think there's an automatic assumption that when it comes to unions, that all they want is more money, more money, more money. And while that's certainly important for anyone and everyone who's trying to raise a family, I think it's also very important to know that collective bargaining goes well beyond just economic issues. I know we're getting ready to do some negotiations at KU Med. We represent the nurses there. And a lot of times their biggest concerns are not, I need a bigger raise, or we need to do something with our health insurance, but how do we improve our outcomes for patient care? We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough equipment. The equipment is not safe or whatever. So oftentimes those things are far more important and far more valuable to union members than what you may see or have heard on TV, that unions are just greedy and they just want more money. It's not true. We advocate together for all conditions of our workplace, including safety and security issues. So.
Could I say one thing on that? As a school board member, I'll take a step back. I came out of a for-profit education system, or spent a lot of time there, and what I saw was competitive, what will the market bear approaches to salary. And what I also observed, I was constantly, I feel like, dealing with morale issues. So to me, as a school board member, I don't want to see that happen. And in K through 12 right now, the big movement is toward the professional learning community, where you have a small group of teachers who are collectively together trying to figure out what's best for this student or these students. And so by having collective bargaining, you take that market-driven competition away, so that then the teachers are more, I think, it's more conducive for teachers to work together. So I don't think that that's a consensus of school boards right now, or even of superintendents, but I don't think they know what they're getting themselves into to get into a competitive approach.
afraid you're right. I think they're gonna end up being on the wrong side of this. I know that there was another piece of legislation that was introduced, a big charter school law that was defeated on the House side. Apparently there is a similar bill on the Senate side. I'm not sure where that's at. But you're absolutely right. When you have something that's, something like education, it's a public service for everyone, and it becomes market driven, then there is that competitiveness. But there's also a propensity, rather than focusing on the quality of the education and the quality of the teachers and our people getting the training, the support, and the resources they need to do a good job, are they going to compete? How are they going to get more money? And if they've got shareholders, those shareholders are going to expect a return on their investment in that company as well. And if they have to cut expenses to be able to show that they're making a profit for those investors, where are they going to cut? They're going to cut the resources, they're going to cut the teachers, or they're going to employ lesser qualified teachers so they can pay them a lower salary. I think it is a dangerous, dangerous game for any state to play, but I certainly don't want to see that in Kansas. You know, I think we've got great public schools. I certainly feel like I had a great education both in secondary and post-secondary school, and I think if we turn that over to private corporations, the people who are losers are the kids, and the citizens are picking up the tab. So
Lisa, I see you have a list there.
I do
We're
have
only
a
halfway through the
list.
list.
I know.
And I know Don's list is
Yeah,
much
this
longer.
is the list of anti-worker bills that are out floating around. Those are the ones that I mentioned are the ones that have gotten the most
Are there any bills that
press.
all of you have heard that you would like to hear her address?
Those are the big ones.
There's one I'd like to bring up here if I could. Senate Bill 82 is the renewable standards, and I'm sure you've all heard that news. That was a voluntary agreement between the utilities and Governor Parkinson, I believe, at the time that sealed that deal, so Sunflower could have their Holcomb plant, and Westar, I believe, got a great increase out of it. But anyhow, that was voluntary. That bill is going to have a hearing Tuesday. We had a session on it this last week at the legislature, and nobody knows who brought the bill forward. I mean, it's
More
everybody.
pillars of courage.
Farmers Union's opposed to the bill. Farm Bureau's opposed to the bill. The utilities didn't testify whatsoever. Every utility has met their requirements for 2020 already for renewable energy, except Westar and Sunflower, but they're well on their way. Right now, electric generation is being produced cheaper than coal. So, I mean, it's just gonna happen. But yeah, we got this bill that's either gonna back it up or repeal it. And so, it's like, well, who introduced it? Utilities didn't even testify, and everybody else is against it, but this sucker's probably gonna pass.
Kind of like civil service, nobody wanted to claim it.
Don, can I be clear? I wanted to check with you on that. I think it was Utilities or Energy Committee. I thought that it had been voted down in the Senate committee. And this was a week ago, but you're saying it's been brought to the floor anyway?
It was voted down, you're right. It was voted down, but now they're bringing it back for a secondary hearing.
In committee or on the floor?
In committee.
Really?
Tuesday.
It was passed on to the House, and there was some discussion about the House maybe revoting.
Yes.
But we're talking about the Senate, right? We're not talking about the House.
Was it referred to a different committee? Was it re-referred maybe?
It was reworked.
Okay.
This isn't my specialty, but I sat in on the luncheon Friday,
Yeah.
Thursday.
And I'm on the Kansans for Clean Energy group, and I've been following that.
So you probably know more about it than I do.
you
But
know-
there's a hearing Tuesday, and I'm writing testimony
I'm
tomorrow.
gonna check my emails one more time. I'll look at it.
Let's move on to Oren, and Oren's been pretty quiet here. He's a real knowledgeable guy. Give us some examples where collective bargaining has been successful.
We can certainly give you a couple. Just a couple of general comments. It's seems that in the farm community, when the farmers get upset, they need a new star to pitch their wagon to. And so we've had, you go back in the history, and you've had the Grange, and, you've had Farmers Union, you've had National Farmers Organization, you've had the American Agriculture Movement, and so, and whether that goes by generations or just farmers having the sense that maybe the organization they belong to isn't addressing what I want, I don't know just what it is, but, every once in a while, a new movement comes along, and that's the way it was with National Farmers Organization in the 1950s. Certainly, farmers were dealing with some stresses. The first big exodus out of agriculture was being seen post-World War II, and farmers were, looking for this new rising star, and they had what they called the Dollar Day movement. Farmers get together, throw $1.50. We're going to send, some representatives to Washington, and the reason was to get the legislators, the farm policy, to understand that sliding scale for parity that a lot of the farm programs were based on at that time, that was going out the window. We were getting on a sliding scale. It was under the Eisenhower administration with Freeman was Secretary of Agriculture, and there was nothing good in that for the farmers. The trend was going to continue, the lowering of the farm prices and so forth. And they went to Washington and tried to impress them on the importance of maintaining, that parity scale. And what that means is for everybody to get their share. That's why collective bargaining is good for, all the segments. You protect your position when it comes down to economic, they might be environmental, they might be social issues, but you're working together in order to address the issues of your share of the turf, if you will. And so this then was an activism that came about where farmers were going to protect their share of the turf and address this issue. It was AAA, the Agricultural Assistance Administration back then, as we know USDA today. And when they visited with those people, it became very clear that pursuing that political process was falling on deaf ears. And those representatives that were sent with those dollars that were in the hat came back to the farm country and said there are no answers in Washington to this particular issue that they were addressing. You're going to have to take matters in your own hands and do something about it. And with that, it was kind of a message: take control of your own destiny. And with that, then within the National Farmers Organization (NFO), the concept of collective bargaining for agriculture was coined, and it became synonymous with NFO. We're going to a different course. Farmers taking the opportunity to block their production together in order to be more effective in dealing with the markets that they were dealing with. And in the course of some of those meetings, my father belonged in the Dollar Days, and he joined in an organizational membership when he had the opportunity. The thing that was different in our family, and that kind of leads to my interest in this thing, that he took me along to those meetings. Most of the guys didn't bring their kids, but he took me along to those meetings because we kind of shared a vision. I went back here to that thing about doing something about the market instead of just the cost, and so we shared a vision that that was a place where we needed to do something about it. And I look at that, and as part of OAG, I recited the creed. I did believe in the future of farming. I was one of those guys, farming was in my blood. I was going to be a farmer, and I knew it. I did believe that to live and work on a good farm could be pleasant as well as challenging, and all the things that we professed in there. And after I had a sophomore speech teacher in high school that got me past my timidity of talking to other people, I got to the point that I really, I prepared and presented some pretty impassioned speeches about addressing that part of the FFA creed that said that I believed in less dependence on begging and more power in bargaining. And in a life abundant with enough honest wealth to help make it so, not for just myself, but also for others. And I lived that particular concept. That's what got me started. So, the National Farmers Organization, then, as we embraced the idea of collective bargaining, and the same thing that Donn was talking about on its outset, thousands of farmers joined in and signed their membership learned that we could do something about the market by moving production from one buyer to another, those kind of things. You know, there was a concept there, well, if we were gonna do something about this, we're gonna have to put 75% of the agricultural production together. Well, we quickly learned that all you needed was to have a corner of the market that a buyer needed, and then real bargaining could begin. Okay? And the other thing that we learned was that you could move production into different marketing areas. Sometimes it was all about price, sometimes it was just about making a statement, you know, that could affect price. And so I think one of those examples that I want to share with you that really reached the top level of the effectiveness of collective bargaining, within the organization, some farmers came up with an idea that knowing that if we move production into different marketing channels, that maybe we could make that happen on a larger scale, and they put together a 6-state grain contract that stretched from Texas up into North Dakota, and we were specifically dealing with only wheat and milo, grain sorghum as we know it. And instead of that following the general flow that went down to the Gulf ports, we were going to move that stuff down to Texas and go to the West Coast and access the Asian rim markets. Okay, new marketing pattern. And we did that on a pretty large scale, actually. Interestingly enough, at that time, grains went to all-time high prices. And it was the only time in the history of agricultural marketing that we saw grain sorghum, or milo as we know it in Kansas, that outpriced corn. And there wasn't any question but what the action that we had taken as an organization was, that was a direct result of those actions. The other thing that happened was that just about the time that we hit those high prices, then Nixon clamped on an embargo, a Russian grain embargo. And again, it was very clear that that was a stab at the heart of collective bargaining. And that was even more evidence just later than that. This is just a little bit pre-Watergate, when there was a document that leaked out that Nixon had an enemy list. And part of that enemy list included NFU/NFO. And well, we felt pretty good about that. They were good. Those were good bedfellows. Well, maybe bedfellows is not the right term in today's society. We were in good company. we were in good company. Along with that, on that same enemies list were like AFL-CIO. Was kind of listed the same way. There were several other collective bargaining organizations were listed there as well. And so we had, with some axes in collective bargaining, reached to the very highest levels of government and created a reaction. Well, some of the farmers, you know, kind of got to be asking, well, you know, should we really be involved in this, if this is the after effect of that? But there began to be a pretty good understanding of what we could do. Unfortunately, at that time within the organization, we had some people that let their personal interests and their egos get in the way, and we, you know, started seeing the downturn in effectiveness. I often try to imagine if we could have built from that point on, you know, what could have been accomplished. But there again, you know, that's water under the bridge at this point, but it very distinctly points to the success of collective bargaining. Now that, you know, that's where the NFO hat comes from. So now we're going to change hats for a little bit. In that same time frame, within those people, many of them that held memberships in the National Farmers Organization, they had some concerns about some other issues in agriculture as well, and that was the direction that we were going toward the high intensity inputs into agriculture, the new technologies, fertilizers, chemicals, and the mantra was, well, we've got extension that's studying all of this, and if you'll just adopt all of these things, then you're going to be successful. Well, there were some of the guys that started, some of these farmers were seeing a downside to all of that, and it wasn't. It had to do with several things. You know, the depopulation of rural America was going on, and what that was doing to our communities. And I think you can all understand too. You know, collective bargaining, what it does for the communities. You keep the money out there, and your communities can thrive. The other part was that as you looked at the intensive farming methods, is the damages that were being done to our basic structure, the soil out on the farm. And there were some of those guys in those circles that never bought into all those new technologies, and they were proving that it was not only feasible, but it was also economical, it was also profitable. And so it kind of a slow transition, not buying in, I think would be the better term, into all this latest stuff. Well, as that movement began to grow, it became known as organic farming, okay? And once it kind of got a toehold, it really started growing exponentially, because there were a lot of consumers out there that were concerned about what this was doing to the food system, and they were starting to look for some of this organic stuff. And so here in Kansas, we had Kansas Organic Producers. And basically what it was a platform where these like-minded people could get together and discuss some of their common interests in the methods, some of the challenges that they faced in that regard. But one of the things that came along, it wasn't too long, and the issues of marketing and organic certification kind of took center stage. Right about that same time, the Kansas Rural Center started. So these peripheral issues that we had been involved in, many that had to do with a more sustainable farming system, kind of had a tendency to lean over to the Kansas Rural Center. And the farm producers, the organic producers within Kansas Organic Producers decided that because of these complexities and these marketing situations, we needed a marketing program, a marketing and bargaining program, where we could exercise some collective bargaining activities. Our first initiative was to go back to the National Farmers Organization. We initiated a visit. Timing was wrong. Leadership within the grain department at that time wasn't interested, so we came back to Kansas. And the Kansas Organic Producers reorganized and became a marketing cooperative, turned the peripheral efforts over to the Kansas Rural Center, and still collaborate with them regularly today. And throughout that whole organic movement, what I'm talking about is some organizations that relate to marketing. What I'm really glad to see is that we have the opportunity to collaborate with organizations to make the legislative part of that, their priorities, and keep us informed, and we try to support those to whatever degree we can. But we try to focus our things on marketing. So it didn't take long as we started a marketing program for our producers that it was still pretty local in the overall scheme of things. We needed more information from other places, and in that search we found out that there were several other groups that were doing similar to what we were. They were looking for some opportunities to develop marketing and collective bargaining. And so there were some discussions and through some meetings that Greg was part of the Institute for Rural America at that time. We had a couple of meetings. We discussed the idea of developing some kind of an umbrella organization where we could work together. Well, that discussion led to some of the things we had learned about the Capper-Volstead Act, where the farmers are granted some inherent rights against antitrust. And under that, whether we could establish a marketing agency in common. And so that movement began to happen. And as we were looking for a name of it, we called it OFARM, Organic Farmers Agency for Relationship Marketing. So relationship marketing, what we were talking about is to position ourselves as producers to be able to enter into negotiations with the users of our products in a relationship type of an attitude where we can have the benefits for both the buyers and the sellers, and in that to retain at least our fair share of that market that represents the overall food dollar. And that's really what we were after. And so several of the things that we've talked about, there's a brochure about OFARM back there. There's a copy of a target price list. We get together, the producers sit down and decide, what are truly sustainable prices in the organic community. At least we're going to the market with a price goal in mind, even though we may not always achieve it. Currently, we're exceeding those price goals because of some market conditions that currently exist. So it's been a progression, but just to go back a moment, that activity I was talking about with that 6-8 grain drought, that put millions of dollars in farmers' pockets. It didn't just raise the price of the grain that these farmers have moved to Texas. It raised the market, and it put millions of dollars. And the same thing is true in the organic market. As we started this initiative, all the buyers were willing to do was maybe pay a little bit of premium, over and above what the conventional market was. And the movement that we were putting together began to establish the pricing of organic products in their own right, and taking into consideration what it costs to grow pretty dramatic. Soybean prices doubled. And corn prices were a little bit slower to respond, but over a period of a couple of years, we moved them out of that route. And hadn't we done what we did, I believe very firmly, and many organic producers that are part of our movement would agree, that if we hadn't put some effort into putting that kind of a movement together, we would still be in that same situation of penalty premium over and above conventional, instead of having some kind of a place in the market. And in closing, I'd just like to read a small part of the preamble to the Old Farm bylaws. And I think this can resonate about what these like-thinking people are all about, and what we hope to accomplish with our commonality and working together. We recognize that in order to maintain this sustainable management system of production, the raw food product produced must move into the food marketing system at a value and volume that is commensurate with the producer investments required to establish and maintain a viable production unit. Market price levels must include a reasonable return for labor, management, and the financial investment. We further recognize that this value must reflect the costs inherent to maintain the social and the environmental infrastructures of our total food production system for succeeding generations. Therefore, we resolve to unite and stand together for economic justice in the marketplace. To this end, we pledge to each other our cooperation in our efforts to inventory, manage, and market the fruits of our labors by defining and maintaining our just share of the wealth in our American food production system. Those ideals of collective bargaining are not just good for farmers, they're good for communities. Collective bargaining is much more than just money in the farmer's pockets. We want to see the churches and schools out in the country. We want those communities to survive. We've pointed, several examples where, it's being pretty seriously eroded. And I think we stand for some ideals that are real benefits from the perspective of collective bargaining.
You know what scares me the most about the alternative is, 70% of the stock anyway is traded on using computers. So you don't. It's not only that when you're dealing with commodities. Not only is it that you have speculators trying to bid up prices so they can make money on that alone, but that there would be computer-generated software running this stuff, which has nothing at all to do with what you said, a market-driven economy, which says, I produce this, I get the best price for it. And so it makes perfect sense that you would get together collectively to take that crazy part out of the whole system. It just makes complete sense.
We deal with those issues now in the organic market. It was about a year and a half ago. We met with a young lady who was a White House fellow. Now, imagine that. It's coming right down from the top. That was doing a study on the viability of futures trading in the organic market. Okay? I don't think that was coincidence that had a connection coming directly down from the highest levels of government. I think they wanted to make sure that the organic farming part of the market would look similar to the current market that we have today. So,
what do you see are probably the top 2 or 3 problems with genetically modified crops or products in the farm today?
I think I would summarize that this way. There is room for these new technologies that come into agriculture. The problem, as we see it, is that using genetic modification as an example, that the corporate profit-driven aspect of that whole thing and the hold that companies like Monsanto can get on those processes is really where the problem comes in. So that whole process is not driven by what can it do positively for our food system. The whole process is driven by how much money can we make for our stockholders, and that's really where it comes from. Now, aside from that, there's study after study at this point of the genetic serious concerns, you know, aside from what I started with. And it's not allowed in the organic community at all. It's just, you know, simply a no-no. And one of the huge sideline issues that we're dealing with is the unintended presence. You know, we can't avoid it anymore. You know, it's all over the place. It just, it's out of control already, and we can't avoid it. And our question is, you know, what strategies can we put in place to do as much avoidance as possible? One more thing I might say about that that's a huge issue. So they had an AC-21 committee, and they were studying the needs that would be there in order to have a greater level of a coexistence system between genetically modified and IP, okay? That's not just organic, but that would be other non-GMO products. So there's a couple of things that came out of that committee. First of all, we wouldn't want to say that there's anything wrong with genetically modified stuff. I mean, this is new technology, and we really got some good things going. Secondly, we certainly wouldn't want to give any implications of any problems with that might damage the marketing system and, you know, create any chaos within agricultural marketing and some of the things that are there in the countries that won't buy it. You know, they're over there trying to get it sold anyway. And the third thing was that if there was some damage from this unintended presence on IP, what kind of a system should be put in place in order to maybe compensate for some damages that might occur? And in that process, somebody came up with a harebrained idea that we're going to connect it to the federal crop insurance program. And that in and of itself wasn't so bad, even though the program is not at all designed for that. The next thing is we're supposed to be self-insured. In other words, we as organic farmers are supposed to pay the bill for any damages that might occur from unintended presence of GMOs. And we're supposed to pay the premium, and that flies totally in the face of any kind of legal, you know, historical process that has ever been in place as it relates to what happens out there in the farm community. Everything else that you do that might affect your neighbor, you're responsible for it. It's very clear in law. And in this one, the patent holders and the users of the genetically modified process want to totally skirt any responsibility or liability for any damages that might occur.
What a great deal for them.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
That'll work great for Monsanto.
I'm going to take this time to ask everybody in the group here to think about the topic that we have here is collective bargaining good for Kansas, and reflect upon what it is that you've heard this panel talk about, and we'll just kind of go around the circle and make a few comments about the relationship between agriculture and labor groups, trade unions.
I grew up on a family farm and still have the original homestead there, so I have an interest in it. But I've learned so much more than what I ever thought that I knew from you all today. That some of the organizations, the early organizations that you met, I remember hearing talked about around the kitchen table at my home. And it's interesting that what has happened to them, collective bargaining has to be some kind of answer. There are 4 people, but I'm interested too in the Farmers Union, which seems to be there, but now we mostly hear about the Farm Bureau, and I don't want to get you launched onto another thing because I know what Greg is doing here. But sometimes that would be interesting to hear, Don.
I found this totally inspiring, that we have this history in Kansas, that we have the quality of people who can do this analysis, and that by knowing your history and the analysis that you do, I have way more hope that we can keep on facing these issues collectively. Thank you very much.
I'm a lifelong union member of one labor organization or another. And I know the value of collective bargaining. The only difference between agriculture and labor collective bargaining is our product is us. And I really have nothing to add to that. And some of this stuff is some of the stuff I've heard about our legislature up here, which is really should have surprised me, but it did. You know, I'm constantly amazed at what we've got going in Topeka in the last year or so.
It really is as bad as you thought it could be.
Oh yeah, it's as bad as I thought it could be.
I'm kind of both worlds, actually. I was a small farm, you know, and I've done been a member of a union for 20-some years, you know. I have concerns. I think we're both fighting the same corporate monster, actually, in giveaway, in a collective bargaining unit. My concern on the seed is Monsanto controlling what you do with their seed. Is fact, I just put cherry oats in, and in that, I'm like, I read that agreement on the way home after purchasing it, and I'm like, my gosh, we're giving them, I mean, I have no right to hold any of that seed. I can't, I'm watching a court case now against Monsanto with a fellow with soybeans on a federal level that's going to the Supreme Court, and I got big questions on one corporation having that much power, you know. Teachers, I bleed for that. We have a small school, rural center our way, and I know those teachers are purchasing supplies on their own because it just isn't there otherwise, you know. So I wish we could get the message out a little better, and maybe between labor and farm combine a little bit, because we're both fighting the same issues here, you know. So that's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that the general public is unaware of how much damage is being wrought against them in the legislature right now. But that is gradually changing. There was a summary, I had an exchange with Ben Waring, the editor of the Salina Journal yesterday, Gene Schodorf, who was voted out by the radical right last time, has the thing for modern Republicans about exactly, you know, summary of much of what you talked about, Donn, and more. And they just republished a Hutchinson editorial summarizing that in today's paper. So that's good, but I think it's also good that Ed is here for public access television. That's one thing that needs, these kinds of forums are what need to get on public access TV. Church is fine, but we need more of this kind of thing. And we definitely need a more active media presence. I don't know how we get that, but this is a beginning. So, anyway,
What did you find out about Senate Bill 82?
Oh, yes, it's House Bill, it referred over the House, HB 2241.
Yep.
And Linda Herrick, in charge of that committee, brought it up this just Thursday or so without any new testimony. So it's kind of in the air about where it goes, but it's a House committee. It was rejected by the Senate committee, but it's still kind of kicking around there.
There's a hearing Tuesday morning.
Is there? Okay.
I guess, for me, two things. One is, on the collective bargaining, I think that term has become pejorative, and people don't even know what it means. And what really struck me from a non-farmer perspective is that the alternative, when you have people gambling, like at a casino, trying to make more money, and then you have people out there devoting their whole lives on a farm and generations that could go by the way or the wayside because of the gambling. I think that's something I wish you'd write to the Salina Journal, write a letter to the editor, putting it in those terms, because that, for me, it was really where it made complete sense. That, what do you do when you have that? You get together a group and you say, okay, we're not going to give you any food until we have something that's more fair for us, because what you guys are doing, gambling, is not fair. And the second part of it is this merit-based approach, which is another way of saying competitive-based approach for teachers. David and I both come out of the arts and humanities at the college level, and we know that English teachers are a dime a dozen compared to some of these other things, even though we may be teaching, working more, grading more, spending more time, having larger classes, because general education is so important, we don't get paid for it. And in a collective bargaining approach with teachers, they have a certain, you know, based on years of experience and degrees overall, that's fair to everyone. Because we believe that being able to write well, as I currently teach now, I can tell you some students I've seen with their writing is just unbelievable. That's so much in sports, public speaking, which isn't maybe valued as much as something, you know, like we always talk about math or science. So to me, that's where the collective bargaining for Kansas will keep us. And the other problem with merit-based is on what basis? Is it a high-stakes one-time test that then determines how a teacher does? Is it popularity? What is it? Nobody can answer that. So collective bargaining seems to solve that problem.
Okay, I think the discussions there hopefully are enlightening to people that have just been on one side of, say, education, or haven't actually grown up on the farm, haven't been through 4-H, FFA, haven't been out there riding on a tractor. If you're a city dweller, a lot of people, or younger people, generations now, don't understand where the food comes from. They don't know how to go out and make a living. They don't have a background to go out and grow something. Know what they're doing if they had to. There's a lot of awareness that's going to come out, and where's our food come from, how did it get here, and what's in it. So we've got a lot of educating to do with the public and with ourselves, and there's a huge legislative fight going on now, whether it's controlled by the little farmer, the independent farmer, or the major corporations making money off of us.
Well, I feel connected to family farms through my wife's family, and it's just striking listening to what you all have said. What an existential threat these various bills, whether produced through ALEC or whatever, or through the Brownbackian ethos, what a threat they pose, not only to the family farm, but to the existence of communities in many rural parts of the state, and ultimately, you know, feudalism may have worked fairly well in the Middle Ages, but I don't think what we want really is a return to some sort of, or not a return, but a new version of feudalism, where we have corporate feudalism turning us all into serfs and slaves to the multinational corporations. And it often feels with the influence of money in politics, not just on the local level, but on the national level, flowing in part from crazy Supreme Court decisions that make money equivalent to speech, and corporations' people, that we're just headed in the direction of a world run by multinational corporations, not for the benefit of people, but in subservience to the profit motive, which just is not an appropriate way to deal with education or healthcare or a number of aspects of our lives that are fundamental to good living, and to a society that has compassion, and that has a thriving electorate, a thriving population.